I had access to when we're recording. There we go. Thanks. I'm going to give the type of presentation that I wish I had when I was, a 12-year-old like comic enthusiast that loved art and telling stories and that sort of thing. When I give a presentation, that's kind of always my vibe. So hopefully today I'll dig into some of the ideas and topics that you're thinking about out there if you're a young aspiring artist, or maybe you're like a fan of comics in general, or you're a fan of me or my book, or you're just here because your parents opened a laptop and pointed this at you. I don't know. But we're talking comics, we're talking storytelling, and we do have a special guest here today because let me share my screen. I love making slideshows, so we've got all kinds of slideshows here today. And there's our Shark Summer slide. And Brenda, if you want to just step in here, we'll just introduce you right here off the top. Everybody, this is Brenda T. Shark. My book, Shark Summer, is inspired by the film Jaws. Brenda was actually a stunt performer in that film. It's like a lesser known fact. You actually can't even Google it. It's not even available out there. But she's going to stop by a little later and talk to us a bit. But we're going to kick off here with, before we start talking about the book, the making of the book, and then doing a little comic lesson. I announced in my social media post that I was going to be giving away 3 copies of Shark Summer signed for you or someone you think might enjoy it. And we're going to do a raffle here at the top. We're going to do one in the middle at the half-hour mark and one at the end. So here's how you can participate in the book winning raffle. We'll bring this next slide up here. All you got to do is in the chat, just write, what is your favorite summer movie? One of mine is Jaws, like obviously. Maybe yours is Jaws too, that's fine. But I want you to type your favorite summer movie in the chat if you'd like to participate in the raffle. And Brenda is over here just off camera, and she's gonna look through the answers. She'll pick a name at random, announce it, and then we'll give you some information for how you can claim your prize and tell us where to mail it and what forth. So take a moment, answer this question. Maybe your favorite summer movie is, I can't even think of any other movies but Jaws right now. I'm just like in the Jaws zone. So think about yours for a moment. All right, on we go. We're gonna start off today with a little story of how I made the book Shark Summer. I will not be spoiling the book, so if you haven't read it, that's fine. I'm not going to ruin it for you. But I am going to do a little offering of insight into the process. And a friend of mine posted this graphic on social media the other day, and I felt it was completely accurate. And in fact, I think about art this way. This idea of like, think of an iceberg, right? And if you're on a boat, journeying across the Arctic and you see an iceberg, you're not actually seeing the whole iceberg, right? You're really only seeing like 10% of a giant form that goes deep below the surface that's existed long beyond when you've appeared and observed it. That's really what it is like to be an artist. So like Shark Summer, if I hand you this book or you pick it up at the library or a bookstore, this is really only 10% of the process that led to the creation of the book. So if you've ever sat down yourself to write a story or draw a picture, you're bringing a lot to the table, right? You're bringing your experience, you're bringing your own ideas, you're bringing your own process. All of that is what I mean by the below the surface part. It's the stuff that your audience isn't seeing. So today's workshop is really about that exact topic. Like what exists below the surface of the final art projects we see in the world. Here's just a quick look of me sitting at my work desk when I was writing Shark Summer. This was 2 summers ago, actually. I was sitting here at this very desk I'm at now with my big Wacom drawing tablet and the software Clip Studio Paint. I'll bring that stuff up again later if you have any questions about tech and the things I use to do my own work. And a couple reference books. I was reading a lot about Jaws to kind of inspire myself to tell the best version of this story I could. Hearing a couple mics out there, make sure you're turning your mics off, folks in the audience. Now, when we get into our lesson in the second half of this, we're gonna make a short 4-panel comic strip. And we're going to use the elements of sequential art or comic storytelling to create that comic. And when I teach comics, I like to address like these three core elements of storytelling: character, obviously; setting, obviously; and theme, obviously, but a little more abstract than character and setting, right? So as I'm talking about my book, Shark Summer, I'm going to talk about it in terms of those elements of storytelling: character, setting, and theme. Now, if you're like me, and when you want to learn something, it's actually super helpful to have a pencil and paper out and be writing things down. It could be things that I'm directly saying that you want to remember for later, or it's just ideas of your own that you might want to inject into a project. Always be taking notes, basically, is what I'm saying. And that applies to, you know, art, life in general. Always be taking notes. So the story of Shark Summer, we're going to start with the setting. Shark Summer is, in fact, set in a real-world location. Whether you've seen Jaws or not, let me kind of clue you into the context of Jaws. It's a story about a small New England island that is terrorized one summer by this giant kind of monstrous shark creature monster. The island is called Amity in the film, but it's actually Martha's Vineyard, a real place in New England off the coast of Massachusetts. Here is the map of Martha's Vineyard that appears in the front of Shark Summer. I love books that have maps in the front of them. I mean, if you've ever picked up a J.R.R. Tolkien book like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, I mean, all good fantasy stories have a map that lets you kind of engage with the world on a deeper level. It brings a level of believability to something. Now, before this book, I hadn't really done a graphic novel set in a real world place. I love fantasy and science fiction, and usually my stories were set in fantasy locations, places that you couldn't actually travel to. And when I set out to do this book, having a real world setting really changed how I approached this project, because it got me thinking, wow, when somebody sits down to read this specific book of mine, they could actually go to this place and see some of these real places. Now, of course, the characters in the story aren't actually going to be there to meet, but you could almost kind of have your own Shark Summer in a way. And that was like really appealing to me. And it led me to do a whole lot of research about Martha's Vineyard. And I was really surprised to find that that research led to inspiration for the story. So just looking at this map right now, some of the locations on it are real places. Some of them are fictional. Like, for example, I marked down some of the iconic lighthouses of Martha's Vineyard. Like, what do we have here? We have like the Gayhead Cliff Lighthouse, or we have the Cape Pogue Lighthouse. But then we also have Maddie's house or Lex's house. Those places aren't real, but they're kind of mixed with real world places. And that brings a level of believability to my story, right? Now here's a look at a spread from Shark Summer. And now we can see the characters actually engaging in this location. So a fantasy story set in a real place. It was like a new, interesting challenge for me. And maybe it could be a cool thing for you to try. If you've never told a story set in the real world, you might consider it. Sometimes people think nonfiction is all like history and could be kind of dry and boring. But actually, the truth is the real world is just as strange and odd as like anything you could ever imagine. And we'll get into that a little as I share some more slides here. I started by collecting an archive of all the iconic locations of Martha's Vineyard. So probably if you've ever been to Martha's Vineyard, you know the Black Dog Tavern. It's this historical inn that's been on the island forever, and it's been under different ownership and opened and closed a few different times. But it's always been in this one location. And you can go, it's a tourist shop. You can get a t-shirt. You can get kind of a mediocre hamburger. I wanted a setting like this to appear in my book. So like, for example, in the panel here, you see the character Gail walking past what I'm calling just the wharf onto, part of her story. But on the left, we have a real world setting. And I gathered a whole bunch of photos from the archives of newspapers. I think it's called the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, I believe. I started looking through old issues of that and getting a sense of what it was like to actually live on the island. Now, the story of Shark Summer is set in 1974 because the book itself is about the year Jaws, the movie, was filmed on that island. The Hollywood crew actually traveled to Martha's Vineyard to shoot the film because the director, Steven Spielberg, wanted to really authentic feeling experience for his movie. So I wanted to take the same approach to my book. I wanted to get a sense of what it would have been like to be there and the types of characters you're going to meet. And then as I told my story, I could have my characters engaging with like these local residents in the same kind of way. And that comes right down to simple settings that you don't even think are that important. So here's a couple panels of Gail and Elijah riding their little motorbike by the Chillimark fields. And on Martha's Vineyard, there's a lot of historic stone walls from when it was all old farmland that are still there to this day. Of course, now they're all covered in moss and algae. And but they still represent, you know, boundaries to different plots of land. I wanted to show things like that in my book and give a sense that there's a history beyond what you're seeing in the story. That's part of adding the believability to your comic storytelling or any type of visual narrative. Adding elements that hint at the past, like what happened before these characters arrive. Because as you travel the world, right, in real life, you see evidence of what had come before. So your stories really need to do that. And setting is a giant part of that. And setting is also a great way to get inspired to draw things you've never drawn before. I'd actually never drawn a cliff like this, but I wanted to have a scene where the characters travel to the far edge of the island and kind of looked out over the grand Atlantic Ocean and just sort of thought about how kind of isolated and trapped they are for this specific summer. And so I looked up some pictures of what's called the Gayhead Cliffs here. And you can see the way they kind of change color. It's due to the minerals in the mountains and kind of like you get this whole sense of geological history just by looking at that image. And then that inspired a panel in the book, which, you know, that was pretty cool. And I was saying a little earlier, sometimes truth is stranger or just as strange as fiction. I needed a part of my story to be set in kind of a creepy graveyard because the characters, they kind of go on a Scooby-Doo style mystery where they're uncovering like bones and skulls and elements of the past and lost kind of legendary characters. I wanted a graveyard, but I didn't want to just make one up. So I started digging through the archives of Martha's Vineyard and I came across this place called Lagoon Heights, which was actually a housing development that was never built on Martha's Vineyard, but it was kind of marked out and mapped as if it could exist. And I was like, oh, Lagoon Heights is an awesome name. I'm going to use that. And I'm going to use this actual map for the kids to discover and find this kind of lost cemetery within this proposed housing development. You see how adding something from the real world just brings a little bit of believability? Like you could Google Lagoon Heights, Martha's Vineyard, you would get this same map. And I think that's kind of cool. Like suddenly you're having the same journey as the characters in Shark Summer due to the research, you know, and that extra below the surface work I did to tell this story. And then the other cool thing about setting is sometimes you stumble upon an image that really inspires something like fundamental about your story. And you just didn't know it was going to be there for you. That's part of the fun of, you know, telling the stories, like digging up images and having ideas just appear to you. I found this cool picture of 4 pillars that look like they were kind of like ancient relics, but actually it's just basically the foundation of a 100-year-old fishing club on the far edges of the island. I'm like, wow, it's so interesting that I looked at that picture and thought of it as this kind of like ancient Lord of the Rings type, like Easter Island monument, you know, just sort of like something so old and fantastical it doesn't seem real. But then quickly realizing it's actually like a real world setting. And then if you look at Shark Summer and you go to the opening of every chapter, you'll see an image that looks a lot like the ruins of that. And so this photo really inspired the whole structure of like a 300-page book. It gave me a way to start every chapter with this kind of like visual mystery that's actually rooted in the real world. So again, all that is to say that when you're looking at setting and story, like dig below the surface, like discover new things that are going to inspire your storytelling. Always be like open to new ideas. Okay, here we go. Now, the story of Shark Summer, it's a little meta. So it takes place on the island of Martha's Vineyard, but it also takes place behind the scenes of a movie called Jaws that is about a town called Amity on the island of Martha's Vineyard. So the story is really set in Edgartown, but the Jaws story is being set in Amity. Kind of like weird and like brain twisty, right? That's part of that's part of the fun of the book to me. It's like these kids are accidentally falling into this movie that's being filmed and going on their own weird adventure. So I have a couple panels in the book that kind of allude to that. Now, part of the story, I wanted to evoke what it might have been like to be there behind the scenes of that movie. And some of the characters in my story are really inspired by types of people you would have on a movie set. So starting from when I was really young, I always loved behind the scenes stories of movies. Like I would watch Star Wars, but then I would want to know like what George Lucas had in mind when he set out to tell that story, like what got him to that place where he was so inspired to create this world and get a budget together and make this like movie. Making movies is hard. It's not easy. It's not like you can just sit down and do it. You have to like really believe in your idea, right? So I always wanted to know what the inspiration was for these big creative projects. And the time and place of making a movie, like I don't know if you've ever made a movie or if you've ever done a creative collaboration with anybody, whether you were in a band or maybe you sat down and made a comic with a friend. There's something magical about the friendships and relationships you have with someone when you're doing something creative. Sometimes it's fleeting, like a movie like Jaws was filmed on Martha's Vineyard the summer of 1974. Those people all traveled there to do that project. Then they went away and they were never in that scenario again. It's like kind of magical to think that that came together just for that moment to create this iconic piece of movie history. I wanted that vibe to kind of like resonate with Shark Summer. So you'll notice if you look through the book, a lot of the characters are people that could have existed behind the scenes. And some of them are also maybe actors that appeared in the movie. And how do I evoke that? Well, I use actual screenshots from the film. So there's a frame of the Jaws movie where Chief Brody is walking across a beach of a bunch of characters. You know, who knows who's going to get eaten by a shark at this point? We have no idea. And I use that actual location and those characters in a panel in the book. Now, speaking of characters, let's talk about developing characters a bit. So we talked about setting, an element of storytelling. Let's talk a little bit more about the characters that engage in these settings. When I sit down to design characters, you know, there's a level of me that wants them to be believable and represent real people in the world. But there's also the other part of me that just thinks about Jim Henson and the Muppets and why those characters are so relatable and iconic. Just look at this cast of Jim Henson characters. See how they're all distinct color palettes. They all have distinct shapes and textures and forms. Like they're like Bert and Ernie are so identifiable by the shape of their nose. And it just comes down to basic geometry. So when I sit down to design characters for my story, there's what they represent in the story, but visually, I just try to make their look really clear and distinct. And it's about creating contrast visually on screen, right? Or on the pages of the book. So Elijah, Maddie, Gail, and Lex are all designed to look different than each other. And it's not just about like complexion and skin tone. It's about like hairstyle and shape of their eyes and nose and the way they carry themselves and all the different forms, visual elements that come together to represent them on the page. So when you're designing your characters, think about how you can make them stand apart from each other, because that visual contrast is going to help you tell a story about those characters better. Because think of the way we tell stories, adding conflict and tension between two characters, a hero and a villain. That's like the core of good storytelling, right? So even when characters are friends in a story, making them look really different can add just more clarity to how they relate and what they represent in a story. Now, Elijah, Maddie, Gail, and Lex, for the most part, represent different creative fields in movie making, because Shark Summer is a bit about that creative process of coming together to tell a story. So Maddie is the director. On the left, we got a photo here of Steven Spielberg. He's got his iconic clapper board that he used on the set of Jaws. It's got little shark's teeth. Isn't that so clever? I have Maddie holding one of those in the book to represent that she's the director. She's guiding the story the kids are trying to tell in their book, because Shark Summer is about making a movie and trying to tell a very specific story. And Maddie's got her own vision of what that story represents. And so therefore, she is the director. And then we have Elijah. He is the kid with the camera and he has all the resources to make the movie. Because what is a director without their crew, right? here's a photo from the set of Jaws, and Jaws was being edited on film, like real, like literal film, like a big giant reel of film that needs to go through a chemical process to be developed. This is before digital stuff, right? So there's a dude editing with his cool Jaws shirt on, the actual footage that they're filming at the time on the island. And so as they make the movie, as they shoot the film, they're actually editing it together on site. So Elijah represents the part of the process that's about putting the story together. And really editing, if you think about it, the way the story is put together represents what it is to the viewer. And editors don't get a lot of credit on movies. Like, so always when you watch a movie, take a moment and look at who edited the film, because that's, someone's getting some feedback there. Mic's off, if you would, please. The way the story, anyway, what I was saying was the way a story is put together is so crucial to how we engage with it. And that's what Elijah represents in this story. And then, of course, every story needs a character that's like the point of view. Like, think of, again, Lord of the Rings. You have Bilbo or Frodo Baggins, depending if you're reading The Hobbit or Fellowship. You have the character who's entering into this fantastical world for the first time. And you, the reader, are also having the same experience. So you need a character to relate to. So in Shark Summer, I have the character Gail. She's not really a movie maker, but she is going to sort of be the on-screen personality for the project. She's kind of like the documentarian with the microphone that's on location, pointing at things and gesturing to the camera. But she's a little oblivious as to like the story that's really coming together. So Gail represents a point of view for the reader. And that's something you got to think about with your characters. Really, what you're doing is with a character is creating a point of view for your reader to engage with the story. You have to tell your reader what to look at, when to look at, what it means to the story, right? If a character looks at a sign that says no swimming hazardous area, you can see Gail here is reacting to it like, oh, the beach is closed. What's going on? And then this guy who's working on the film has to tell her that it's a prop. So that sign at first meant something different to her, but then changed once she realized the context for it. And this whole story is about that. It's about changing your point of view of a story and the pieces of the story. All right. Now, we've got a kind of a secondary character, but pretty crucial to what this whole story represents. And that's the character of Bruce the Shark. Now we have Brenda who's here with us, and she'll be stopping by in a couple minutes to say some things. But on screen, for the most part, you're not seeing Brenda, you're actually seeing Bruce. And Bruce is not a real shark like Brenda. Bruce is a mechanical shark. There are actually 3 Bruces made for the movie Jaws. And you can see here's like a diagram of the pneumatic version of Bruce that needed to like come out of the water and arch up and kind of, attack a boat. There was no CGI at this point. So like any visual effects you had in your movie was like things people had to physically make by hand. So Bruce is basically a big pneumatic kind of piece of machinery with a Jaws shark costume put over it. And there's a whole bunch of great behind the scenes photos of the mechanical Bruce, who's like this giant monster. And it's just kind of funny to watch the different prop mechanic folks like kind of reach inside the mouth of like this giant monster. And again, I love behind the scenes storytelling. So I wanted this to be a big part of Shark Summer. The kids go behind the scenes and they meet Bruce and they see the way he works and they kind of engage with it and run into a little trouble, along the way. But again, characters are not always engaging with dialogue and speaking to you and going on heroic journeys and whatnot. Sometimes characters are thematic, like in Jaws. The character of Bruce, and actually let's have Brenda, you want to step in here for a minute? Brenda's going to join us here for a second. Hi, Brenda. So you've seen Jaws, true? So in the movie Jaws, the character of Bruce, the shark, is really basically a monster. He's not a real world shark. He's something that represents like an evil, like this kind of impending doom that's always coming at you with these black vacant eyes. Now, Brenda, you're a real shark, true? Do you relate to Bruce in that way? Are you a monster? No. So, but Brenda is an actor in a movie, right? So a character, an actor like Brenda can come in and represent an idea. Like, Brenda, give us your like scary face. Yeah, now give us your friendly face. So, Brenda's a very diverse actor. She can play many roles. You reach out to her agent if you're interested. But the characters in our story can embody themes. So what I'm getting at here as we move into the next part of our little lesson is characters and setting, they all kind of speak to these bigger ideas that are at play below, the surface of our storytelling. Thank you, Brenda. We'll check in with you later when we do our next raffle. Let me share my screen here again. All right, screen's back. So here's the more complicated side and maybe more advanced side of storytelling that we'll get into in like a really basic way with our lesson today. The way we view the world through the point of view of our characters, whether it be a shark or like a young girl on a summer adventure, it really speaks to what the book is about and what it means to us and what it means to the people reading it. So if you've read Shark Summer and I show you like a page with various panels from the story, you have a totally different feeling about what these panels represent than if you'd never read the book before. And that all has to do with theme. It's the stuff that the author is trying to say through the visuals of the story, the way they use color or frame a scene, right? The way they point their visual camera in the story, what they focus on, what characters say, and all that cool stuff. So what's that, Mark? Oh, sorry, I'm not sharing my screen. Let me click this button. Thank you, Brenda. I know you're talking off camera here. How's that? Shared? Okay, sorry. So again, these are the panels I was just referencing. Just to recap, the things we see in a story speak to the theme. And after we finish a book, we have an interpretation of that theme. We'll get back to some of these bigger ideas in a minute. Right now, I'm just going to quickly, as we reach the half-minute point here, the halfway mark of our lesson, I'm going to just share some of the stuff I think is kind of cool that I would have loved to see as a kid reading graphic novels, what it literally looks like when you're making a graphic novel. So you can tell I really think a lot about the stories I'm telling before I create them. And sometimes comics and cartooning can seem to be about really simple ideas and like basic little kid level stuff because they're cute and bright colored and easy to look at. But comics can be about anything you want. They can be deep and rich and full of meaning. And all that comes from the work you do beforehand. So even though I love to draw, I actually write just as much as I draw. So here's a really boring slide. The most boring slide I will show you this evening. This is a breakdown of the scenes in Shark Summer in this great little Google Docs spreadsheet. Before I sit down to make a book. Now, Shark Summer needed to be exactly 304 pages because early on with my editor, we talked about length and that comes down to budget, right? Like we have to print this. The publisher needs to know how much it's going to cost to put this book out. So we had a page count, 304, which means I had to sit down and decide how many pages each scene in my book was going to be. So whenever you set out to tell a story, restriction is always going to come into play. Maybe it's just time. Maybe you only have a study hall before your next class to work on your comic, or you're working on it after school, or maybe your parents are going to give you a couple bucks to print a couple copies of it. So you can only make it like 8 pages long. Restrictions like that are part of any creative project. And so when I make a spreadsheet like this, it's me creating the restrictions for my story. So I know what's in store for me when I set out to draw it. You can see that, for example, the Act 3 apartment scene is only going to be X number of pages because I need to leave room for later when we get to the beach scene. That needs to be 10 pages. There's all this negotiation of how long any scene should be for the sake of how I'm telling my story. And this helps me decide the pace of it as well, right? If I want my story to be action-packed and happen really quickly, I need scenes to move fast. We can't like sit in Gail's apartment for like 10 pages because that's just kind of boring. We got to be in and out. We got to be like on the go. We got to be filming things and all that stuff. This spreadsheet was the pacing of the story and how it's all going to play out overall. Then we get into the fine tuning. Once I know the structure of the story, I sit down and I write a script. So if you've ever acted, you've been given a script with dialogue and stage direction, basically telling you what to perform to get the story across to an audience. That's my next step also, even though I'm making a graphic novel as the final product. I break down all the dialogue of my character with also little notes of what they're doing at any given scene. This really helps me get to know my characters as well, because once they start speaking and having ideas and moving around, then I can get a better idea of who they are. Because yeah, I'm making them up, but they're also going to go on their own weird adventure based on their goals, right? Like, I don't know when I set out to tell the story what was going to happen to Elijah at the end. I had to find that out as I told it through dialogue and stage direction. So I have, like an 80-page document that's just dialogue. Cool, huh? All right. Now I finally sit down to draw it. And like I said earlier, if you're curious about tech and things like that, I use a program called Clip Studio Paint. It's available in a desktop version and a iPad-y tablet version. It's kind of like Photoshop, a little like Procreate, but in that it's a drawing program where you have pen tools and coloring tools and textures and all that stuff, great brushes. But it also has a side of it that lets you lay out pages of comic, because a comic has a very distinct look and feel as a medium, as an artistic medium. It has panels, it has pages, it needs to turn. Sometimes you have a spread, bigger panels, you have speech bubbles with dialogue. Clip Studio Paint helps you do all that stuff, whereas Procreate doesn't really have all those dialogue and speech bubble tools. And Photoshop kind of does, but it's not really designed to do that. So if you're an aspiring cartoonist out there, you might want to check out Clip Studio Paint for your own work. And so I sit down with this program and I start setting up my pages. These are called sketches or even thumbnails, which are loose drawings done with a non-photo blue pencil to represent what's going to go in each panel of the comic, and also dialogue. So there's my rough draft. Now, every artist has their own take on how they sketch. Some work really detailed, where you could literally see all the final art in the pencils. Some work super loose, where you can barely read the visuals at all. I'm somewhere in the middle. You can kind of get an idea of the story by looking at my pencils, but you can see they're also a little messy. After that comes the final inks, where you don't really trace the sketches, but you use them as guides to help you set up what becomes the final art in the book. So the pencils go away, and then you see just the finished inks. And after the inks are done comes what is a really rewarding part of the process, and that's the colors. To me, colors are like the emotional language of a comic. Like, here's the black and white version, right? Now here's the color version. See how it kind of comes to life in a different way? Suddenly you have a sense of how you should feel about this scene and this mood, right? Like black and white, you're like, okay, I guess it's nighttime. The characters are kind of doing this. Whoa, the shark's breaking through the ceiling. That's intense. But once you put color on it, now it feels like a little grittier, a little realer, a little more emotional, right? And as you look through Shark Summer or grab any graphic novel off any shelf, you're going to see the artist using color to kind of enforce the ideas and themes in their story, right? So color is not just like literal representing the reality. It's not about green grass and blue sky and skin tone and all that. It's about like using red for antagonistic energy or using blue to represent melancholy, right? Emotional color thinking. All right, so basically that's kind of like the making of Shark Summer in a nutshell. And if you've got any questions on that, we'll take a minute or two here in the middle section here to answer any questions about the book you might have. And then we're gonna hop into our drawing lesson. So what you need to do, think about questions, go grab a pencil and paper if you want to participate in the drawing lesson. And if you would like to win a copy of my graphic novel, Shark Summer, signed and delivered to a doorstep of your choice, you need to enter the raffle in the chat. So what I'd like you to do for this one is tell us, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? If you've read Shark Summer, you kind of know what I'm getting at here. Like, ice cream plays a very crucial role in the story. So tell us your favorite flavor of ice cream. And Brenda is on hand over here to look through the chat and pick at random a person. So we'll give you a couple minutes to do that. We'll wait a bit. But what we'll do now, Carolyn, our trusty host and moderator here, do you have any questions from the chat that have come up that
I have somebody who's asking, do you do everything on the tablet?
Oh, great question. Yes, at this point, because it's efficient and fast, I work on the tablet. But for many years, I worked with pen and ink and watercolor and really cheap paper. So work with whatever you got is my advice. But I do like working on a tablet now that I have the budget to do that full time. So, yep, all on a tablet these days.
Okay. And then Thomas asks, when I draw comics, I struggle with starting dialogue. What guidance can you give me to better script my comics that make it enticing to a reader?
Okay. Well, again, that's part of that 90% below the surface. I always write it out in a text document first and kind of imagine how it's going to play out, like if it's a movie and I can imagine the character saying it, and then I edit it down because you probably overspeak in the way I might be overspeaking right now. If I were to write this conversation down for you, I would edit out half of this. Same thing applies when you're trying to tell any story. Edit down, and of course there needs to be flavor, but keep your information and your dialogue short and, especially with a comic, kind of like spunky and punchy. That's my advice. Edit your work. Any other questions?
I don't. Let's see. Nope. Everything else is just ice cream flavors.
Perfect. Right. I love a list of ice cream. Oh, raspberry. Good choice. Okay, I won't get distracted by that. We got so much to talk about in 20 minutes to do it. So here's our crash course drawing lesson. Speaking to these bigger ideas of setting, character, and theme, we're going to do a short little 4-panel comic strip. On screen right now, you see my example comic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the creative process of making a little short 4-panel comic. What you can do while I'm speaking is make notes for yourself about your comic. You could even draw it. Everybody has their own workflow, right? There's no magic way to make a comic that's the same for everybody. There's no solution, right? It's whatever it takes to get you there. So if you want to draw and write while I'm talking, you can do that. If you want to sit and focus and listen, and you could do that too. But I would recommend, if you have an idea, get it out of your brain and put it on paper. Because if it sits in there, it's going to clog up the flow of other new ideas. So get your ideas out of your head, even if they're bad. I got many pages of bad ideas out there. Don't be embarrassed. Get them out of your head, put them on paper, and move on. So today's little lesson is we're going to make a 4-panel comic strip themed around animals and this idea of a relationship animals have in the natural world. We're going with the theme of mutual benefit. So we're going to talk about those 3 elements in these really simple terms, because I'm sure if you look at a graphic novel, it's so intimidating to think about how somebody could do that. I'm 40 years old. I've been doing this like my whole life. That's the only reason I'm good at all. It's because I do it all the time. But I'm going to strip this down to a really simple project. So hopefully you can go through some of the steps I go through, but just in a really refined, simple way. We start with character, right? Now, a story of animals is a great sort of way to engage with the reader, because we all have these preconceived notions of what animals represent in a story. Because think of animal stories you've heard in your life. Think of a story like the tortoise and the hare. That story has a theme, like this kind of tale of slow and steady wins the race. The tortoise represents slow, because in the real world, tortoises are kind of slow in context to a hare or rabbit, which is quite fast. Now, of course, these animals don't think of themselves that way. That's like humans projecting personalities onto animals, because that's what we do. And these tools, or these preconceived notions, can be great shorthand for telling stories. So if I show you an alligator and a bird character, you can see they're great for creating contrast in the story because they're so distinctly different. At first glance, if you don't really know maybe too much about how these animals sit in, the circle of life, as the Lion King would put it, you might think they're antagonistic, like an alligator is the enemy of the bird. But we'll kind of get to a deeper truth over the course of this story. But I'm glad you might think that they're villains, because with stories, you always want to lead somebody down a path and then kind of trick them into a new way of thinking. That's the best type of story, is when you reveal something new to the reader over the course of them reading it. Okay? So when you're thinking of characters for your story, think of animals that have strong contrast. And of course, your story doesn't have to be set in a real world. You could make up a type of animal if you want, or you could use animals from the real world, put them in a fantasy story if you want. Okay? I'm using an alligator and a bird. Think about scale, form, behavior, all these things I have on this slide to help you generate the cast for your story. The next step, which goes hand in hand, it's not like you do characters, then setting, then theme. You can do all these things in whatever order you want. you need to pick a location for your story to be set, right? And location can evoke feelings in the reader because of our preconceived notions of them. So if I say I'm going to set my story in a swamp, it feels totally different than setting it in a mall or in your childhood bedroom or in a forest or in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Setting is so crucial to a story. And that doesn't mean you have to really draw all kinds of background details. It just means you have to evoke a setting. And that's done through composition. And look at how simply I've drawn the swamp setting. It's a horizon line to represent still water. It's a kind of a gnarly, deadish tree. And it's got a little rock in the middle. If you've ever designed a set, maybe you were in a play when you were in middle school or something, and instead of acting in it, you were part of the crew and you designed the set. Think of how you did that process. It's all about placing things so the actors can engage with them in a way that tells the story. And you'll see when I show you my finished comic again, why I put these elements where they are. Okay, now theme. How does all this stuff come together? Well, just like with the dialogue question, when you're writing dialogue or when you're designing characters or coming up with set, think of the point of view of your story. Now, if you've ever read a memoir or a nonfiction story, that is very clearly about point of view. It's about somebody's experience, but point of view applies to any story, right? If you've read Harry Potter has a point of view, but his friend Hermione also has a very different point of view of that same world. If you wrote a book from Hermione's point of view, it would be a very different book than the Harry Potter story we know, right? So when you're telling a story, try to get in the brain of your characters and think of how they're engaging with the world. And that's how you create a journey for a character. It's how you get the reader to empathize with them, to see why they're happy, why they're sad, why they're on the run, or why they've pulled the sword from the stone, or whatever happens over the course of your story. So for our story, we're keeping things very simple. I'm making our story about the theme of mutual benefit. And I've done a little graphic here to kind of represent that idea. Like, how does the bird and the alligator kind of create this harmonious balance in their environment? I think mutual benefit is a really interesting way to tell a story because it's not about good and evil. It's about like how two things exist in the world. Like Shark Summer, there's no villain in it, really. It's about just finding your place in the world. And most stories are really about that, right? So it's a good thing to tell a story through. Here's my 4 panels. The magic of comics is deciding what to do with these panels. And something I always say when I teach a workshop is when you draw a comic and you draw these frames, they're not boxes. They're not like things that you put stuff inside of. They're windows. They're views into a world. It's the lens of a camera, or it's like the view through the eyes of a character, which is to say that you don't see everything at once. You see what you want the reader to engage with. So here's 4 points of view. Point of view 1. So you can see on the side here, I've broken down my thought process that led me to this composition. Whenever you're drawing a panel, and this is why you sketch and write and do that 90% of below the surface stuff before you create the finished art, because you need to know what you're trying to say with your story. Even if you're not using dialogue, you have to decide on what your panel is about. Panel 1, I want to show the alligator in a really lonely state, thus the swamp. Swamps, even though they're filled with life forms below the surface of the water, they can feel empty thematically. And when I draw it, I'm drawing kind of this kind of sad, lonely place. I put the rock right in the middle. I put the horizon line way up so you can see the vast open emptiness of this swamp, enforcing the idea that the alligator is in fact kind of sad. And then to really let you know, because comics are always about emphasis and over dramatization, he's sobbing. He's like literally sobbing out loud. So we feel bad for the alligator. Pretty good, panel 1. Now cut to the point of view of the bird. The bird is on the run from these antagonistic birds. They're not really villains, but they are chasing him. Maybe he was on their property or something. They're trying to get rid of him. And you can see they're antagonistic because they have like a pointy beak. Again, shapes can enforce what we're saying with our story. And they're coming in down on him hard, and our bird is nice and soft and cute. He's got big round eyes. So we know he's the sympathetic creature in this panel. So therefore, we're giving a new point of view from our secondary character. Now we're going to bring all this stuff together, because the story of a character is how they act and react to their environment. So now we're zoomed in really close on the tail of the alligator. Kind of an advanced technique with comics is not showing everything at once, showing like just aspects of different things to help us really get a sense of what they are, or to build tension. Like in this case, we see the bird has found sanctuary on the tail of this alligator. But the way I framed it is to imply that, is this actually safe? Like, we don't really see how the gator is responding to this yet. We just see the pointy edges of his tail, which is in fact keeping the antagonistic birds at bay, because even they're too scared to approach this gator. So through the course of the story, we're possibly putting our character in a little bit of danger. And that's what gets the reader to want to turn the page, right? Is this kind of looming danger. And Shark Summer is full of stuff like that, reasons to turn the page. And then in conclusion, we show the resolution here, right? And this is a happy ending story because the theme here is about how animals learn to get along. And it's not necessarily about independence, it's about finding your place in the world. So we see that, and this is a thing that exists in reality, right? A gator can have like, the bugs or parasitic elements of its environment kept at bay by a little bird who also finds sanctuary by hanging out with this alligator. So the gator could eat the bird, but they're not going to because the bird is creating a benefit. So they have this kind of harmonious relationship. And when you see photos of this or see it for real in nature, it's kind of interesting to see like this tiny little cute bird at ease with just hanging out on the back of this giant prehistoric animal. So hopefully over the course of these 4 panels, you see how I've chosen characters that represent a theme. I've picked settings that kind of enforce different aspects of that theme. And I've used my panels very carefully to let a story play out that evokes this theme. Now, it's not like I literally say, and that's a story of mutual benefit, kids, like one to grow on. It's just sort of vibing through the story. And whether you take that away from it or not, it really doesn't matter. You can do what you want with the story once it's done. And that's something in conclusion here, as we kind of get into a Q&A in our last raffle. I'll say that, yeah, you are telling your story, but think of the bigger picture. It's actually about what people take away from your story. So you're kind of creating a springboard for somebody to engage with your characters and have an experience of their own. So yeah, I sat down 2 years ago and made Shark Summer over a really long and stressful 16 months. But now it's out there for you. And what you do with the book is really what it is. So I've done my part. And the same thing can be said for a 4-panel comic. Tell your story and then hand it to your sibling or your parent or a friend and let them read it. Don't tell them what you're trying to say. Let them have it and engage with it on their own and see what they have to say about it. Because they might have insight into what you're saying with your work that you might not get. And that's the cool thing about comics, everybody. Yeah. I'm going to take a deep breath here for a second.
All right. There are a couple of questions, Ira.
Good. Let's do the questions. Then we'll do our last little raffle here.
Okay.
And Brenda's going to join us too.
Oh, good. Someone asked, when you do word balloons for a ghost, how would you draw those?
Oh, great. Things like that, when you're trying to decide what a word balloon should look like, think of the feeling that you're trying to evoke, like say the dialogue out loud. You can see I'm using a ghost voice right now. It's got like a wobbly feeling, which implies a line like this. When you look back, I love looking at old pictures of like old Disney animators from the 50s, because they're always acting out what their characters are doing. And that helps them decide how to draw certain things. So if you're trying to create a speech bubble that sounds like something, act it out and get a sense of, how it feels, and then create a line that looks like that. So yeah, ghosts kind of speak in a wobbly line. And maybe you use little like thought bubbles instead of like the line, the tail. And look at references. When you look at comics, think about that stuff. Think about how artists use their line work to tell their story. Good question. Any other questions?
Somebody asked, have you written anything other than graphic novels?
Brenda, have I written other things besides graphic novels? Yeah, in fact, not as other shark stories. So this is the first shark story. But if you go to my website, I have some fantasy and science fiction work there to, it's all really free for you. I even have an audiobook of like an illustrated kind of kids adventure story that I wrote a couple of years ago. So yeah, I do love comics and I'm going to keep doing it, but you know, I've animated, I've written, I've done poetry, I've written songs. So yeah, I do all the things. And it's all on my website. Go enjoy when we're done here.
And that's all the questions that
Wow, I covered all the bases. Okay, Brenda, are we ready for our last raffle? Did you pick 2 winners from the previous ones? Okay, cool. Now again, when you win, if you already have the book and you want me to send the book to somebody else, that's totally cool too. But let's bring up the slide one last time. And so we can look at our final question here. All right. To wrap things up, in the chat, because this is a library event, this is about celebrating books and sharing books. I'd like you to recommend a book that you really love. It could be something you read this summer that just like blew your brain open and you never can think about the world the same way again. Throw it in the chat. Maybe it's a book you read as a kid and you're like, this book is kind of lost to time. I wish kids were out there still reading my favorite Ray Bradbury story from 1952. Throw that in the chat. Maybe it's you're here to self-promote and it's a book you released for free or you're selling through your Patreon or whatever. Maybe that's your favorite book. Throw that in the chat. Maybe it's your biography or a friend's biography or a book a teacher gave you. Throw it in the chat. Recommend a book you love. Brenda is over here. It's hard she has her eyes are kind of on each side of the head, so you can't see her, but she's really kind of going back and forth here. And with those fins, it's really hard to type it. She is doing her best to kind of gauge all these great responses. I can see the comments are just flowing. Oh, Amulet, I see Amulet in there. Great graphic novel. Hobbit, never heard of it. Just kidding. Classic. Redwall, Mice, fantasy adventure stories. We could just list great books all night. We could do just another hour of listing great books, right, Carolyn?
Yeah, I'm all for that.
Oh yeah, well, you're ready
to ask a question about your college education, Ira.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I went to college with Brenda, in fact, in Rochester. I went to the Rochester Institute of Technology and I studied graphic design, which isn't exactly what I do now, but it's been very helpful in terms of setting up layout books and self-publishing a lot of my own stuff. So I studied graphic arts, like commercial art. So I'm really good with like Adobe products, basically. But I've always loved to tell stories, so I eventually returned to that after graduation.
And we have a question about the name of your dog.
Oh yeah, well, of course, we haven't talked about Dottie specifically. I think she's fast asleep here on the floor. She has no idea what's going. She doesn't know what Zoom even is. So that's Dottie. She's 50% chow and then kind of a nice mix of other types of dogs. She's a rescue, and taking her on walks is where I always have my best ideas. So, when royalties start flooding in, she's going to get a good cut of that.
That's all.
Is that in fact the end?
It is.
Okay, cool. Well, we got a couple of minutes.
Somebody wants to know what your favorite book is.
Oh, what's my favorite book? Oh, wow, great question. Well, okay. My favorite sci-fi novel is Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, which is a bunch of short kind of poetic stories about exploits on the moon. It's like kind of dark and satirical. It's very funny and like very creepy, which is exactly my vibe, like right there in the middle of scary and very funny. So Ray Bradbury, Martian Chronicles. My favorite graphic novel is probably Bone by Jeff Smith, because I grew up reading that as it was coming out. Like I literally grew up from like 14 years old till being 23 as he was making that story on a monthly basis. So I grew up with Thorne. So yeah, Bone, Calvin Hobbes. If you're into learning more about comics, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics is like an essential book for inspiring you to make comics and seeing why they're so great. Yeah, that's a couple right there. What's your favorite book, Carolyn?
My favorite. That's a really hard one. There's so many good books.
Well, what's one you like? Do you want to throw something out there as the
I just read a really good book called Place to Hang the Moon, which is a young people's book. And I really
okay, good. That's a good title.
I really, as far as graphic novels, probably Bone is actually up there for me. And whoever just said Greg says George the Overland. I think it might be Gregor the Overlander. It's by the same woman who wrote The Hunger Games. But
good one.
You know, that's a really good one is City of Ember. I think
Yep.
it's really good.
It's a good,
Those apocalyptic type books, you know?
yeah, it's nice to think about the world ending. But we won't end on that note.
No.
I'd like to say, Brenda, do we have our three? Okay, if you want to come say goodbye to everybody. Okay. Now, we'll just wrap this up. As the winners, did you type this in the chat? Did you tell them how to reach out to me? Yes? Okay, cool. So Zoe, Thomas, and Andy, congratulations. You've each won a copy of Shark Summer. Email me and tell me where to send it, and I will do so. Brenda is here to just say goodbye to everybody. Thanks for coming. I love talking about comics. I hope you had a good time. And we'll see you next time. I don't know what that means, but that's the thing they say at the end of stuff.
Bye, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. If you want to turn on your mic and say goodbye, go ahead. People can leave.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming. I recognize some of you out there. Hi.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It was excellent as always, Ira.
Thanks, Carolyn. Good to see you remotely.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
What was that?
Thanks, Ira. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, hey.
Did
Some
you
family
recognize
out there?
people?
I know those people. You can tell like they like slightly look like me, just like a tiny bit.
Is Moore the shark?
No. Don't destroy the illusion.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. On that note, Caroline, should we close the event?
That's it. We'll thank you so much, Ira, and hopefully in the fall we'll have a program at the library.
I look forward to it.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Good night. Good night, everyone.
Good night.